After World War II, Walt Disney wanted to get back to full-length animated productions. Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and Lady and the Tramp all showcase Walt himself and show the growth in style and the studio's perfectionism in the animation medium. If you want to know more about those films, check out part 1 of the Silver Era. And as the 1950s rolled on, Walt was pulled in many different directions. Animation and the advancement of moving art became only one of the many endeavors of Walt Disney and his company. What was once the bread and butter of Disney Studio was now just something they still did. Along with television shows, live-action films, and the creation of a groundbreaking theme park, the move to diversify would impact the last 4 films of Disney's Silver Era. And by the end of that era, it would see the death of its most important figure. Walt Disney had a love affair with the romantic fairy tales and their princesses. Snow White was his first big breakthrough in the feature-length world. It helped him turn profits into a big new studio and allowed him to take on larger productions. Cinderella was a story that Walt related to, this rags to riches story. Cinderella brought the studio out of World War II and put Disney's name back into the pop culture of the fabulous 1950s. After Lady and the Tramp, Walt returned to the princess fairy tale for a third time, seeing as it had not failed him yet. 1959's Sleeping Beauty is seen as one of the Disney animation team's biggest achievements in artistry. Production on Sleeping Beauty started all the way back in 1951, with Walt wanting something different, something grand, something modern in style, but still feeling classic in every way. Disney's third princess story would arguably be his most beautiful. The backgrounds, the character designs, the colors. They all work together to create a magical film. Artist Eva and Earl researched medieval paintings, merging them with 1960s color and style. The end result made Sleeping Beauty feel contemporary and timeless at the same time. As far as the story itself is concerned, it was based off of Tchaikovsky's ballet of the same exact story. That take would also lend much of the music to the film and once again have a timeless feel with a classical score. Sleeping Beauty, like Lady and the Tramp, wasn't shot on the traditional 35mm camera either, but it was extended to widescreen on a 70mm camera, adding an extra cost for the company. In fact, the production of Sleeping Beauty, lasting as long as it did and with such attention to detail, became Walt Disney's most expensive production to that date. And despite the success of his previous 2 princess films, Sleeping Beauty didn't connect with audiences in its initial 1959 release, and would be the first time Disney had lost money on a production in over a decade. With that loss in mind, Walt wanted to spend less money on his next movie, 101 Dalmatians. The answer was to speed up the process of painting the animated cells. The studio previously had the ink and paint department trace over the animators' lines when transferring them to the cells, but with the new production, they were instead using a process called xerography, which would transfer the drawn lines from the animators directly onto the cell, allowing for the painting process to go quicker. Animators were absolutely thrilled with this, as it was the first time they actually saw their own black hand-drawn lines on the screen. Prior to this, the ink and paint department would trace over the drawings with colored ink, whereas in 101 Dalmatians, everything on screen has a black outlining. Beyond that change in the process, another change came. Walt Disney had always been very hands-on with everything, from storyboard meetings to watching rough cuts of the animation to advising the art and musical direction of his films. But by the end of the 1950s, he no longer just had an animation studio. Disneyland had opened in 1955, and he had several live films in production like Treasure Island and The Shaggy Dog. And he was hosting a weekly television show, so he handed over the story and production of the Dalmatian film to one of his most trusted storymen, Bill Peet. Peet brought Dodie Smith's 1956 novel to life, with a design never before seen in any Disney film. Along with the xerography, Peet wanted to explore different styles. Ken Anderson and Walt Paragoy were put in charge of the backgrounds, where they gave more of an expressionistic look, using shapes and colors to convey landscapes. The character designs also took on a more contemporary feel, which perfectly matched the story in which the dogs watch television and live in an otherwise modern society. A stark contrast to the fairy tales and hyper-detailed look of the animation team's previous work. Another big difference from previous Disney films is the lack of musical numbers. Instead of big, bombastic songs, the story is filled with a few select jingles, written either by the songwriting character Roger in the film or by fitting those songs into the movie through things like a television commercial for Canine Crunchies.
Canine Crunchies can't be beat, they make each meal a special treat. Happy dogs are those who eat nutritious Canine Crunchies.
Not making the film a big musical piece also saved the studio time and money. As a test of the xerography process, some of the cars in the film were actually built as real-world models, with thick black lines added to them, and they were dragged over mock roads and filmed. That film was then Xeroxed onto cells and painted over, giving a more 3D effect to some scenes with automobiles. This was groundbreaking long before CGI. This was the 1960s. And this was before 3D animation was the norm. It wouldn't be used in any other production, but it would give the animation team the idea and thought to expand past the traditional paper and pencil animation they were used to. This would eventually allow computers to fit into the mix several decades later as another unconventional way of animation, before eventually it just became the standard. Mostly unsupervised, Walt would eventually screen the film before its release, and he made it clear to his team, and especially background artists Ken Anderson and Bill Peet, that the film wasn't good, and it lacked the charm and heart of a Disney production. Critics, however, would have a totally different take on this film. They heralded 101 Dalmatians as Disney's best since Snow White. The film had a great villain, it had mystery, adventure, and warmth. 101 Dalmatians would cost half as much as Sleeping Beauty, and it would be a major success financially for the studio. And after the success of 1961's modern dog film, the animation studio turned to two different productions. Ken Anderson and Mark Davis were looking to create a contemporary version of Chanticleer, while Bill Peet went to work on Sword in the Stone. Walt, not being a fan of the modern 101 Dalmatians, opted to scratch the Chanticleer project and move forward with the more classic fairy tale feel of King Arthur. Still trusting Bill Peet, Walt was hands-off on the production of Sword in the Stone. Peet would write the story himself for the film, and legendary Disney animator Woolie Reitherman would be the lead director of the movie. This marked the first time a lead animator looked over an entire production, and having a single person in charge of writing and another in charge of directing made the story more important than the characters themselves. Many of the characters lack personality and are fairly forgettable, like Sir Hector or even Arthur himself. Instead, the story was filled with philosophical beliefs and ideas, big ideas, about morality and the importance of education, and those ideas play throughout the film, even into the classic wizard's duel between Merlin and Madame Mim. But the greatest gift that The Sword and Stone gave us wasn't its story or its characters, but it was its songwriting duo of Robert and Richard Sherman. Songs like That's What Makes the World Go Round or Higgity Figgity were written for the film, driving the story forward. Walt Disney was impressed by the songwriting duo, and they would end up staying with the studio well into the 1970s, writing songs for more animated films and even some live-action movies like Mary Poppins. And yes, I know Mary Poppins has animation in it, but the film is mostly live-action. The Sword in the Stone would be released on Christmas Day of 1963. to mixed reviews and a lukewarm box office. The film would cost about just as much as 101 Dalmatians, and it broke even, but it was not the huge success the studio was looking for, and its lackluster performance would bring Walt Disney back to take charge of the next film based on Rudyard Kipling's 1894 story, The Jungle Book. Walt would put Bill Peet in charge of the Jungle Book story, but Walt would eventually ask Peet to rewrite the dark and dramatic script that he had produced, and make it into more of a fanciful and fun musical. Peet had not delivered what Walt wanted with 101 Dalmatians, nor did he deliver with The Sword and the Stone. And Peet didn't deliver with The Jungle Book, but he did fight for his story, and Walt stood his ground as the boss, and Bill Peet would eventually leave the Walt Disney Animation Studio for good. Walt would then put Larry Clemens in charge of the film, but asked him not to go off of the Rudyard Kipling book, but instead craft more of his own lighthearted story. For the voices, Walt also wanted recognizable actors, something that was really unusual for a Disney picture. Disney veteran Sterling Holloway was brought in as Kaa, comedian Phil Harris as Baloo, musician Louis Prima would play King Louie, and English film and television actor George Sanders would voice Shere Khan. Louis Prima would even work with the Sherman Brothers to create the song I Want to Be Like You, while the Sherman Brothers wrote a majority of the rest of the soundtrack besides Bare Necessities.
I must go to fetch the water till the day that I am grown.
As production was moving along in 1966, Walt left the studio to get his neck checked out. He would return to the studio amidst the production of The Jungle Book in November, letting everyone know the great job that they were doing, something that he rarely ever did. And little did many of the artists at the Disney studio know that Walt would be gone just 1 month later, passing away on December 15th, 1966, at the age of 65 years old. The Jungle Book would see its release a few months later in 1967. And it was seen as Walt's last film he ever worked on at the animation studio. The film would be a major triumph, grossing nearly 3 times its budget, and by the end of its theatrical run, it had become the highest-grossing animated film worldwide of all time. It's interesting to look back at the silver era of Disney animation, as much of the 1950s were filled with films about Walt Disney. They capture his rise from Missouri mediocrity, his sense of childhood adventure, his work in classic storytelling, and his love for 20th century America. But even after leaving the animation team behind for several productions, he would return to make one last film about himself in The Jungle Book, reminding us all to have a little bit of fun with our lives, and to forget about our worries and our strife. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to watch our other videos about Disney animation, or just subscribe to our channel for great Disney-related content. We also have a Patreon page where we drop more content, including podcasts where we geek out about other things that may not even have to do with Disney. Thank you for watching and making it this far. And until next time, my name's Josh Taylor from Network 1901, and keep on moving, people.